We'll do the bulk of it. Okay, that's nice. Thank you. Well, it's lovely to see everybody here. And thank you to Yuri and Bryce for organizing this. It's super challenging to present such a huge book. So we'll raise some themes, and then we look forward very much to hearing from the discussants, and really these two discussants, we're very eager to hear what they have to say. So this is what the handbook looks like. The cover is quite a big book. And in a way, we hope it figures a future for urban studies. That is a future in which there's many, many more experiments and creative working comparatively in global urban studies. We thought we'd share with you very briefly how it all started. So how might Patrick Le Galès and me be doing this together? We certainly have some slightly different approaches to things historically, and we enjoyed working creatively across the tensions of our different perspectives. But it all began with some collaborative teaching for IJER and RC21, comparative methods for the postgraduates, postdoc students who came to the summer school, the RC21 conference. And there we discovered that we were speaking maybe somewhat different languages, but really articulating the same ambition and desire to build understanding about the urban across different contexts. So we set about the handbook, and we had a very long wish list on which many people, like in the audience and who are not in the handbook, were. Some people couldn't do it. Timetables are often very busy, so we were saddened not to have some individuals involved, and also some areas not thoroughly covered. I think especially a kind of comparative environmental urbanism is something that we really worked hard to get that in, but it didn't materialize. So just bear in mind that the final shape of it is not exactly our wish list. Something which I would figure as a highlight, and I'll come back to a little bit at the end, is that we tried to build in comparative traditions from different regions of the world. And I think that really decenters the narrative and the history of what comparative urbanism is, the different methodologies and the different hopes for a comparison across South America, Eastern Europe. A great contribution from Elena Trubina on Russia, US, which has of course been conventionally very important in comparative urbanism, but also Italy, which in some ways we could say started to invent comparativism for urban studies. Contributions from India, which really try and push the envelope on how we compare in an urban world with both huge metropolitan regions and small census towns, different kinds of urbanization, so subaltern urbanization, which Marie-Hélène Zahra talks about, and Shubhra Gurani, also thinking about more extended processes of urbanization. Also Japan and China. So this is an example of how you might read the book, both through its contents, but also which have been organized thematically, but also arcing through it in different ways. So not all the regional traditions are in the section of that, focusing on that, but you can draw them together. And in the introduction, we try and offer you a few different pathways through the book. So we hope that the introduction will be a useful starting point. The first half of the introduction goes through issues around the history of comparativism, which Patrick will talk about now. The second half does a few of these arcs to suggest lines of connection across the different work. We were very committed, both of us, to incorporating a diversity of approaches, a diversity of disciplines. So we're not very committed to the idea that we try and exclude people for being in the other camp or wrong or whatever, to want to really work with a diversity of approaches, thinking about urbanization as associated both with territories, territorialization, circulations, and flows. And we were so delighted to bring together some people who were experimenting with new ways of doing comparison. That's in the last section. So this is just, you can't really read it, but to give you a sense of the size and scope of the book, so many great scholars joined us. And there's some wonderful pieces. I would highlight here the last one you see here, chapter 45 from Stefan Lance, which is unfortunately last, but also it draws together so powerfully all kinds of different methodologies and insights for a very large global project about religiosity in the city. And I really recommend that one, and another one by Ola Soderstrom, which is a little earlier in the book, which also reports on a couple of quite comprehensive and very fascinating comparative projects. So this is just a picture to illustrate the diversity. So maybe this is the kind of range we have. We have fairly quantitative work about migration to urban areas within different countries, and how that urban transition is working from Randolph and Stolper. And that gives one kind of approach, quite statistical, perhaps fairly causal, sort of focused sense of causality and data-driven. And then on the other hand, we've got really beautiful, almost poetic contributions from Julian Boudreau and some collaborators, text in a very sort of textile almost textual way to bring together different urban experiences into conversation, slowly, carefully, building knowledge through that. It's really a very lovely piece. And the image here comes from, the bottom image comes from Olivier Cramsch, who provides a quite humanities-driven imagination about how different cities might be interpenetrating one another imaginatively. And here we have a famous fictive detective from Germany looking out over Chinese cities, signifying the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative is linking Germany and China together. So many ways in which cities are interwoven within each other, and many ways to frame learning about the urban across different kinds of cities, different methodologies. So Patrick, over to you. Shall I stop sharing and you can put up your screen, yeah?
Yeah. One. Yes. Here we go. So thanks. You can see it, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you again, Yuri, and all the group for being here today. And as Jenny said, it's been great fun and intellectual stimulation to work on this long project. It took us about 4 years to manage to get everything, and it was quite an adventure. So as was mentioned, what is interesting, of course, is, and one of our aim in a way is to contribute to the structuring of a sort of field of global urban studies. We see a range of work being produced in different parts of the world, as Jenny mentioned, and we thought that comparison should be one of the backbone of these global urban studies in the making. So we have an ambition to contribute to that in some ways in this world of cities. So we sort of say, okay, we should think more about that. The second point I want to emphasize is that, when you look at the history of global urban studies and urban studies altogether, in a way, comparison was there. There was always some comparative work, but not a huge amount when you think about the scale of urban research. And until the early 2000s, it was not often the case. And we know that a lot of research was done on the usual suspects of a small number of cities. And it's a bit strange because there were exceptions in the past. You think about Herodot or Ibn Khaldun in the world, or Max Weber, the first part of the Chicago School. There were some people who were doing some comparative work, but that did not remain. And as a past editor of IGUR, I remember trying desperately to get more comparative papers in the journal. And it was quite a struggle at that time to be able to do that. And one of the reasons is we try to, in the introduction, to think why is the case, and we'll go very briefly, but we want to emphasize a couple of things. Number one, of course, most of research, particularly in social science, was national social research, and the 20th century was really the rise of a nation state, and methodological nationalism was the logic. So, until the 1980s, really, not just in urban studies, but more generally speaking, there were hardly any comparison in Europe. People have forgotten that. But, I remember as a student, we just didn't have that. There was, strangely, comparison of cities in the US was also pretty rare. There are some of them, but it was not very common. And it was also very rare in Latin America or in Asia. And Africa was a bit different because of the colonial tone of some of it. Another reason was, of course, the importance of monograph traditions, of course, in urban studies. And we know all the tradition of working on Chicago or Shanghai. Third, of course, the big wave of Marxist and neo-Marxist work, people emphasize really the dynamics of urbanization and capitalism. So although we have seen more recently some attempt to develop some comparative work, like, for instance, global cities, but, emphasizing the process of urbanizations connected to capitalism undermine the importance of comparative work, except at a very high level of abstraction and not often well developed. And again, this has changed recently, particularly with the work on variegation that Brenner, Peck, and Theodore have tried to put forward. And in a way, some of the post-colonial work, not always, but some of it, has emphasized the trying to bring a lot of voices in the debate, emphasizing very particular voices and cases, criticizing categories of comparison coming from Western positivism. So there were lots of good reasons why you should not have so much comparison. So the project of a handbook was really to say, welcome to the world of imperfect comparison. In a way, we wanted also to accept that a lot of classic comparison between a nation state or based only on variation finding strategies and looking at comparison of independent units, which is a classic way method to look at comparison, was not relevant anymore, because we know that cities are not independent unit. One thing we learn is all the connections, all the circulations, all the interdependence. So in a way, our point of view is to say this just doesn't make sense anymore to make comparison in the strict methodological sense of the word. Therefore, welcome to the world of imperfect, innovative urban comparison, articulated at different scale and taking into account interdependencies and globalization process. And that's what has been key for the handbook.
Patrick,
Emphasizing,
just quickly, why don't you put it up onto share the whole screen, because then people can read the
of
text
course,
a bit
yeah.
better.
Sorry.
I wanted to say that, but Patrick was in a flow.
Sorry. So of course I should have done that. So we emphasize, as Jenny mentioned, that we wanted to take into account a variety of cases, ordinary cities, remember Jenny's book, emphasizing that there are a lot of articulation possible between urbanization process and cities, and beyond urbanization and process and cities, really trying to compare not just territories, but comparing all sorts of things, mobilities, mechanisms, networks, emotions, structures, and of course trying to go beyond the Western intellectual world. So what we wanted to do is to stimulate really the imagination and get different ontologies, different epistemologies to emphasize innovation and different comparative imagination. So we're not here to give you best recipes, it's just the opposite, is to open a lot of imperfect way, but stimulating and interesting way in order to emphasize both mixed method, rigorous quantitative, inductive bottom-up, and showing in the handbook different example of how that was done in a number of existing research. So it could be useful for everybody to think about to do the same thing or something different, but related to different type of research that has been done. And of course, we didn't want to avoid some of the debate, okay? Some people want to do a new urban science, some don't. We discuss all the time with Jenny in a very amicable way that, some people emphasize different dimension of urban studies, more classic social science that have to be renovated, or more philosophy, postmodern or post-colonial gender studies. So it's a very interesting world. And I think the handbook is really presenting various research in those debates and sometimes articulating some of those debates. That's, I think, the richness of the handbook. And also we wanted to emphasize that beyond the diversity of regions that has been mentioned by Jenny, actually a lot of disciplines are changing as well. So it's not just a question of discipline. We see, in geography, sociological science, history, anthropology, planning, economics, but also the other ones mentioned on the slide, a lot of new experiments, but also development in method that we wanted to present in the handbook. And again, articulating often some element of cities, some connections, and some urbanization process to go beyond the sort of Henri Lefebvre or not Henri Lefebvre type of urban studies. So what we wanted and what we've done in the handbook is to emphasize a lot some of the empirical processes of mobility, circulations and connection, because that is leading to different types of comparison and a lot of methodological innovations, emphasizing also all sort of variations and hybridity in different contexts, but also taking into account some of the more general process and to see how they would make sense and how we compare them under which conditions. And that was what we tried to do. Whether this contemporary global urbanization and this new imagination requires a complete new conceptualization, that's a debate we have with Jenny, and it's all a question that we'll see over time how it develops and how relevant it will prove over time. So that's something which is different. And among the examples, and then I will stop, we wanted to take into account some of the insight from for instance, the Science and Technology Studies, STS, because those research on instruments, algorithm, quantifications, tools of representations, tools of representation of a city are bringing a lot of new ways to think, both in terms of conceptualization and empirical work about the cities and the comparison of the city. And that also connected to the questions of urban sustainability. So we have some interesting chapters. So in a way, we wanted to develop comparative imagination and then emphasize a lot of different research design that can combine all sort of things in the comparative framework.
Okay, if you just leave your slide up there, Patrick, because you're going to come back now.
Yeah.
So I guess a slightly different cut through some of the issues that Patrick has raised there would be to think about what inspires us to frame comparisons in different ways. So through the handbook, there's so many different strategies, process tracing, some kind of statistical analysis of causality, catching flows of residents, of people and things globally or the neighborhood scale and so on. So many different ways that we dream up to bring different urban contexts into comparison. And my sense as we track through the book is that there are some surprising similarities perhaps, and also some provocations about how we might go about building our understanding of what is worth comparing. So on the one hand, we've had quite a spate of work think about conjuncture. It's not represented very strongly in the book. We have Jill Hart's work on a global conjuncture, this kind of politically significant moment, which she does a very interesting job of tracking beyond the usually national context in which conjuncture is thought. What is politically significant is often considered to be a national, regional moment. She looks at it globally, and particularly about colonial and racial histories that inform this sort of very right-wing nationalism, which we can track across South Africa with Zuma, India with Modi, and the US with Trump. So she gives us really a very interesting way to mobilize the idea of conjuncture. And there's a lot of interesting work coming up from people who are in the book, Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore and Helga Leitner, Eric Shepard, thinking about conjunctural comparisons. And this is not to suggest that the urban is a conjuncture, because it's not, but we can think spatially about conjuncture, which then brings aspects of the urban into view. So that's one sort of side of things. And in the book, we have a great essay from Nick Theodore and Jamie Peck, Frames and Flows, looking at OECD urban policy making, and really focusing on pan-urban processes. So these kind of complex trans-scalar dynamics in which many different urban actors are caught, and that frames insight across many different urban experiences. And then on the other hand, we could, to come back to Patrick's point about a post-colonial critique perhaps being criticized for going in the direction of too much specificity. Everything is just very different. And often people write off that work as not being theoretical. And actually in urban studies, that's a very bad mistake. Because if we think of the urban as always fundamentally specific, necessarily the outcomes are very distinctive and specific as a kind of space, then our ways of building concepts need to build from that specificity to generate our understandings. Doesn't mean to say that our understandings are just attached to one place, but as we come to know urbanization as a generalizing process. We build those understandings from specificity, helping to understand other specific urban contexts. And two works here, the one from the Lefebvrean perspective from Schmid, suggesting that we need to identify different processes of urbanization as constitutive elements of a planetary urbanization, an urbanizing planet. And we identify those by looking at specific concrete totalities of the urban. And on the other hand, we have a Tilly-inspired work by, sorry, I made an error there. This is by, oh, Patrick, help me here, the
Heur
guy from
and Mukhopadhyay.
Heur and Mukhopadhyay. Sorry, that's an error on my slide. Tilly's inspiring them to identify mechanisms and processes of urbanization that are identified because they're emergent in different contexts. For example, what causes the sorting of residential neighborhoods? What causes certain structures and patterns of service delivery? Building our understanding from specificity and using comparative analysis to inspire us there. And then we have others who head in the direction of extreme diversity, very specific experiences of emotional constructs or ways of living and experiencing the city. But nonetheless, these can build wider narratives of urbanism, of experiences of what it means to understand urban life. So I think this is one of the kind of questions that we can ask across the range of approaches in the book, which is, on what basis do people think they can construct comparative imagination? This often depends on how we think of the urban world. Is it part of a wider conjuncture? Is it highly specific? Do we just see a lot of diversity across the urban world? So all kinds of possibilities are presented in the handbook. Patrick, I think that's over to you there.
So you hear me? Yeah? Yeah. So here we are, the content of the book, very briefly. So the book is organized in 5 sections. The first one is more on the inheritance of various urban research traditions. And we try to review, not completely and not as systematically we would have liked, but quite thoroughly, some of the key inheritance and presenting different traditions, not explained both from the point of view of discipline and from the point of view of different origins, geographically speaking. So you see some chapters on the Chicago School, on South America, Yuri and Claire on comparative urban studies in Europe, work on Japan, one paper on historians and actor network theory, Alison Post on political science, the comparative approach of sociologists, and one on social movements. So, they sort of give an overview of not everything, but at least a number of traditions that are not always well known and not always discussed in some of our work. So it opens the floor to a lot of different research traditions and inheritance in comparative urban research. The section 2 is about methods, and we try to emphasize what we have seen over the last 2 decades, in particularly the rise of a lot of innovative methods, both qualitative and quantitative, and as we mentioned before, increasingly connected to the question of data and the type of data that can be combined. But what is interesting also is that we ask the authors to be more reflexive about the methods, about the role of the context, the relation element when they address the question of comparison. So I think some of the chapters are really interesting to be reflexive on the way they have worked, their research strategy for comparison, and how they chose the method they've done in some example of research. Because these chapters most of the time are not sort of just method chapters. They are really how we use some method in order to answer some question. So there's a real effort to combine relation, mobility, circulations with cases and with more than 2 cases. And emphasizing in particular what we call fat comparison, few cases with observations along many dimensions, and the tall comparisons, many cases and few dimensions in terms of data. And you get an idea of those papers we mentioned already Soderstrom in the past, but we see Kubler and Sellers as a sort of super positivist political scientist doing comparative work, or Samson and Candypan doing extremely interesting comparative research, comparing both neighborhoods within cities and then looking at the structure, cities as structure of networks, and then comparing cities from this analysis of the structure of networks. Or Julie Wren on the Art Biennale in Dakar and Taipei, very precise on how she elaborated a comparison in this domain. And some also interesting paper by Boulier on just precisely the use of big data and propagations in comparative urban research. So that gives you an idea. And then you keep going, Jenny.
So I've already discussed a little bit about the way in which how we think of the urban as context, conjuncture, specificity shapes what we can imagine as a comparison. And here in this, we've gathered together a few papers around that theme, and papers which also take seriously the context in which comparison happens. So on that theme, there's also a couple to come from section 1, especially Laurent Fouchard's paper about how thinking from African studies can generate concepts for wider use, especially theorization of the state, ideas of the negotiated statehood or twilight institutions, which could be very useful in many contexts in urban studies. So here we have the questions about conjuncture, specificity, and so on. We also have Malik Simone's very trenchant critique of the possibility of comparison as carrying a racialized haunting, that is, objectification, dividing up the world, thinking about an individual as already constituted, as opposed to thinking about emergent subjects and phenomena. We have Goran Theban's great work inspiring us to think about how it is that different kinds of states are formed across different regions. And from Slavomira Frenchova, we also have a very profound caution that actually comparison is very easy to glibly talk about comparison, but building comparisons is not always geopolitically feasible. People aren't always connected, don't always have the resources to get engaged in that kind of international comparison, or the dominant constructions of the urban do not lend themselves to comparativism. And Elena Trubina's work on Russia talks in that vein. That is, the imagination of Russia is quite distinctive, not thinking necessarily at the urban scale, but the regional scale, etc. And then David Benassi's wonderful paper about some of the Italian origins of the comparative gesture in urban studies is very interesting. And there, the differentiated context is what leads to that comparative imagination, initially across North and South, or different kinds of contexts. Next slide. And then we take a stab at the connections, which has been so inspiring: policy mobilities, flows, migration, things which bring different cities into conversation with one another without us even analytically trying. We're drawn to build those comparisons. We have a whole range of papers which deal with that. So Patrick, you could just go to the next slide. And there's some examples. And I think especially I valued the reflection from the Global Cities Research Group about how their understandings of how the global and world cities analysis had lended itself to comparing and thinking across different cities, how that had moved into actually a more globalizing frame as opposed to just looking at specific cities. So a range of great papers there. Including, I just point out Lukasz Stanek's paper, which reminds us that there's many globalizing circuits to track. In his case, looking at socialist circuits of investment and policy mobility towards African and Asian contexts during the post-independence era. And we also need to layer in questions of sovereign and developmental circuits. So we've been too focused on building through policy mobilities of neoliberalization, financialization, and so on. There's many other circuits that shape cities and bring them together. Okay, and then the final section, experiments, speaks for itself, perhaps, all kinds of interesting people finding each other to generate new insights, thinking about unusual comparisons or new ways to do them. So Patrick, you could just go to the final slide. And here we loved to bring in a paper from Janet Abelugard, which is not really very accessible. I couldn't find it in the British Library or my own libraries here in the UK. And this is an article in which she reflects on her own different work in New York and Cairo and Chicago, building up quite an experiential sense of how to bring these cities into conversation. I thought that really exemplified some of the enthusiastic approaches that people have taken on board. So Patrick, maybe we just end it there?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot. You have been rushing through the whole thing, and given the complexity of this book, it's not an easy task. But I think the discussants will bring in some additional aspects to be debated. I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe John?
Ross, is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay, this is a fantastic book, and what a Herculean labor it must have been over 4 years to put it all together. The two editors both are exemplary scholars of comparative urbanism themselves and important thinkers about how to do urban studies and comparative urban studies. And I don't know all of the contributors to the book, maybe about half of them, but each one of them are really at the top of their game in the areas they're covering. And reading the articles the chapters by people that I don't know, I would say the same thing. They're all extremely interesting, well-informed, stimulating. So it's really a fantastic accomplishment that is the sort of thing that you'll consult both. I don't know anything about Chinese cities, so I'm going to read Fu Longwu's chapter in this book, and people will dip into it to learn things about places that they don't know anything about. But also I can see it very useful as a teaching tool in contrasting methodologies and regions and just thinking seriously about how to do comparisons. So just, many congratulations both to I've edited quite a few books myself, and I know that you're always hostage to whoever's the greatest laggard in getting the last chapter in, and how many, hairs you can pull out of your head trying to get a project like this finished. And this is really superbly done. So you're to be greatly congratulated. You might think of the kind of urban studies that I do as the subject of the explicit and implicit critiques of the book, because I study cities in the United States. I have a small n comparison between New York and other cities like San Francisco and Boston or Los Angeles. I'm working in a first world, I don't know if you could call the US colonial exactly or not, but the source of all the conceptualizations that scholars in other parts of the world don't think fit their circumstance and need to be deconstructed and reconstructed and reconceptualized. But I only would say in my defense that the people that do the kind of work that I do would never dream of alleging that they would be appropriate categorizations and concepts to study, say, Chinese cities in the contemporary period. And there isn't really a chapter about comparative urban studies in the US in the book, and that's partly because Patrick asked me to write it, and I didn't have the bandwidth to do it. So it's my own darn fault, I suppose. But I do want to say that I think my take on comparative urban studies would stress something that is a little bit downplayed in the book. It's not absent, but I would draw a distinction between, maybe to use what demographers called stocks and flows. So flows are movements of population in and out of places, people being born, people dying, flux, the patterns of dynamic change across the whole system. And stocks are, what the population of a city at any given point of time. And I think similarly, you could contrast the use of the word urban with the word city. So urban processes are really things that are flowing across the whole system of cities, whether it's capitalist development or migration or financialization or gravitation of religious ideas or policy diffusion, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that are cutting across systems of cities. And to some extent, the cities get a little bit lost in that. They're reduced to being a function of larger dynamics. And I think Neil Brenner's point of view takes that to an extreme. And I don't think people know that Neil got a PhD in political science. And I think he's completely forgotten what he learned when he was in graduate school, because cities are actually containers, they're jurisdictions, they're governmental units. They're definitely entities with all kinds of powers, the power to tax, the power to regulate, to some degree, the power to shape markets, to invest capital, to hold elections, to respond to constituencies. And so for me, the key papers in the volume are the ones by Jørgen Therborn and also the Kubler and Sellers kind of overview of the types of city jurisdictions that are out there, that take the city as a unit of analysis that is still important despite interconnectedness of cities, despite all the forces that are flowing across the system of cities. And most of the essays in the book, the local government drops out. There are a bunch of the interesting case studies, like the stretch of cities from Accra to Lagos in Africa. They are talking about what city governments are doing and how they're relating to each other and the creation of infrastructure and so on. But they're not really theorized as a constituent element. And so I would just say, to conclude, that yes, urban studies needs to evolve to understand other parts of the world beyond North America and West Europe, and this distinctive character of urbanization in cities in those places. And yes, urban studies needs to highlight or forefront the types of dynamics that are flowing across all cities and shaping them and reshaping them. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that cities are also entities capable of action and creating change in the system, and oftentimes the basis for change in cross-city systems of one sort or another. Anyway, fantastic book. I take my hat off to your being able to pull it together. I know edited volumes sometimes are like herding cats. There's a lot of coherence to this, and a lot of the chapters speaking to each other, and it's a very generative book that I think all of us will be reading for a long time. So thank you very much for it.
Thanks a lot, John. I think a generative book, it's a really great compliment, because it generates thoughts, ideas. It improves the willingness to engage with such kind of studies. And I think that's really very nice. Bas, your turn.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John, also for the great comments. I hope some of the remarks I'll make are complementary. Thanks, first of all, to Jury for inviting me on the publication of this wonderful handbook, and to be invited together with John, especially also as other discussants. I only have about 10 minutes, so I've organized my comments, I think, as 3 brief observations that might be interesting for further discussion. So I try to engage more or less directly with the handbook, not only mentioning, let's say, a few authors specifically, but hinting at some themes, while offering also a slightly broader contextualization, I think, to reflect a bit on the state of urban studies today. While reading the book, I find myself verging towards, let's say, broader reflections on the sociology of science, which says something about my own interest, I think, but it's also a bit about how the book is compiled. And so some of my comments touch upon these issues. My first comment would revolve around the very genre of handbooks and what this might tell us about urban studies as a field of research. So that's my first reflection. I think we can be very fortunate, very much in line with John's comment, that with this Handbook on Comparative Global Urban Studies, it is edited by 2 leading researchers in the field. It has contributions from a stellar cast of people from across the world. And the handbook, in my view, really offers for the first time, really, a more or less exhaustive overview of what comparison does in urban research. So I think, yeah, I take my hat off as well. Of course, we all have our preferences. I particularly enjoyed part 1 on traditions in comparative urban research and part 3 on context. But there are many, many other, let's say, individual chapters that are just really top notch. That said, what does the proliferation of handbooks tell us about urban studies today? I was doing like a quick check online, and in recent years, so meaning the last, let's say, 5 years, we've seen publishers like Routledge and Edward Elgar publishing handbooks on, and I'll use some titles here: urban studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, urban segregation, mega cities and mega city regions, urban politics and policy, cities and networks, cities and complexity, shrinking cities, city and regional leadership, historic urban landscapes in the Asia Pacific, urban systems, urban social policies, urban mobilities, urban sociology, and I'm sure I missed quite a few already. And this is just the last 5 years, right? Now, this is quite different from the situation, let's say, 20 years ago when I was a student, which feels rather confronting to read here that I was a student 20 years ago, but that's another discussion. As at that point in time, I became attracted to the intellectual debate around the urban studies, cities, also due to a number of, or mainly due, next to excellent journal articles, but mainly due to a number of well-crafted edited volumes. So thinner books, you could say, that have since become classics in the field. Again, personal preferences, but I'm thinking here of Yuri Kasepost, for example, 2005 Cities of Europe, of Gregory Eindruches and colleagues in 1996 Cities After Socialism, of John Eade and Christopher Mealis 2002 Understanding the City, or also Alan Scott and Ed Soja's 1997 The City, Los Angeles and Urban Theory at the end of the 20th century. For me, these are really foundational books that I became acquainted with as a student, which really, let's say, attracted me to, let's say, urban studies as a field of research. Now, as I see it, we can observe a shift, but I mean, it might be interesting to discuss this in itself, a shift away from, let's say, well-crafted edited volumes towards massive sprawling handbooks. Unfortunately, this is a well-crafted, massive handbook, but it is a handbook. So now from the publisher's point of view, there's clearly a commercial imperative. I think we shouldn't be naive about this, right? Handbooks are expensive, but they will be bought by university libraries across the world. So there's a kind of commercial logic behind it. But that, of course, doesn't necessarily overlap with the logic of the editors and the authors contributing to these handbooks. Still, what does this tell us about urban studies? Has urban studies become so fragmented, or more positively phrased, has urban studies become so diverse that we need handbooks instead of edited volumes to create an overview of a debate? So that would be my first question in relation to my first observation. My second observation, and I'll start a bit critical, but I don't mean it as a critique of the handbook. My second observation is that global urban studies is not necessarily particularly global. I mean, I wrote recently a paper about this, but that's maybe on the margins of my comment. But it also shows in this handbook. I did sort of the head count of the authors, and there are 61 authors in total, if I counted correctly, some with multiple affiliations and hence locations, and of which no less than 20 are linked to the USA or Canada, most of them to the US, 10 to the UK, 30 to the rest of Europe, mostly from Northwestern Europe. I'm counting Austria here as Northwestern Europe. We can discuss if that's the case. And only a handful to Mexico, South Africa, India, and Brazil. And those are actually the only other countries when it comes to institutional locations. So it's obvious if we would take a simple map of the world that there are many, let's say, blind spots, or let's say many empty places on the map, so to speak. Now, obviously, the location of authors is only a partial story. I mean, the institutional location. And the actual cities, regions, and countries, and also the biographies of the authors are more diverse than this list. But even then, this remains a particular version of global urban studies. As I said, I don't mean this at all as a critique of the handbook, far from it. This is something I think we are all struggling with on a day-to-day basis. The story, I think, is also more complex than what you sometimes hear. It's more complex, I feel, than one of Anglo-American hegemony and academic knowledge production. At the same time, there is a centrality effect. And this, in turn, creates a very specific geography of global urban studies. Now, in all our fascination for, let's say, loose comparisons, innovative comparisons, imperfect comparisons, and also experimenting with different modes of comparisons, I do think we tend to underestimate this kind of structuring power, these actual geographies, actually existing geographies of urban studies have on everyday researchers and on researchers. I think Jenny already mentioned the chapter by Slavomira Ferenchova, which indeed tackles these kinds of questions. Now, as a research task, and this is where my, let's say, my hat as sociologist of sciences comes in, I think this suggests we need a more materialist, discursive, institutional approach to the sociology of sciences. What is the research capacity in which places? How is research or urban research institutionally organized? What kinds of discourses and disciplines thrive or not in such a setup? Could it be, and I think the answer is yes, but could it be that urban research is being conducted in all these invisible places, but with the use of different vocabularies not typically used in urban studies? Again, various chapters do touch upon these issues, but it could use almost its own, let's say, international research projects, I sometimes feel, to really get to grips with some of these details and also the historical, in a way, the historical sociology of some of these elements. So that's my second observation with some questions. Now, this leads me to my third and last observation in my reading of the handbook, and I really consider this a key strength, and I think it was mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. There is throughout the various parts a recognition that we need to drill down to the regional level in order to better understand the composition of global urban studies. And this claim, I feel, and this is really a strength, I think, of the handbook, is developed both empirically and epistemologically by paying attention to regionally distinct comparative traditions, the relative importance of various disciplines, and of course the similar but also differing contexts. And this is something I think which I really learned from a lot, and which is sometimes, let's say, underemphasized in some of the other comparative global urban studies type work that I've been reading over the last, let's say, 20 years. There's at the same time, obviously, a recognition that we can no longer look at independent units that can be compared, and that we need to recognize globalization, networks, and the circulation of people, materials, and discourses. But still, I sense throughout the book an interest in recovering and excavating this regional dimension. Or maybe that's just my interest that I'm projecting onto the book. I don't know, but I'm happy to hear some insights on this. This also includes, I think, a recognition of the importance and of the centrality of the national state, and how the national organization of space actually differentially impacts cities and regions across this territory. And this is a point particularly developed in the Terborn chapter. Now, this third and last observation raises for me a very basic question. Can we see now or in the future a kind of rapprochement between urban studies, regional studies, and perhaps even national studies, if that would even exist? So that would be my last question. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot to both for this excellent discussion and comments. I would pass the ball to Jenny or Patrick, because Patrick has to leave a bit earlier. Maybe he starts and then Jenny continues, if it's okay for you.
Of course, it's okay for me, and I apologize because I will have to leave because of this time mistake. Thanks for the comments, very generous of yours, and we can start a discussion on those issues rather than to respond. And I think it's to be continued. On John's point, John is both right. Indeed, this dimension is a bit not as strong as it might have been, the city's dimension. Of course, it's also his fault because we expected a great chapter from him, and he could not do it because he was writing a book, so he has a good excuse. Nobody was blaming him at all. I would just say that in the inheritance part, the first section of the book, you have much more on the cities dimension than is there, and also on the Alliston Post paper on political science, she touches a lot of those issues as well. But the point is still taken, and I take that, and I think you are quite right. This idea of action, in a way, what I would suggest is that people working on cities, in the sense that John has mentioned, maybe there is less innovative or less systematic comparative work that has been done, and maybe even more monograph along those lines. So I think you're right to sketch a sort of agenda for more comparison, identifying some of the dimensions that you just mentioned about connected to the cities, like the action and the power to tax and doing this sort of things. And that's still a bit underdeveloped also in the existing research. And that explains also why there's not so much of that. Even in the US, there's not so much being done along those lines. And in Europe, as you know, we've done some of that, but not enough because of this articulation with the nation level. So I take your point, and I think you're right. It's something that we must think about that. Thanks also, Bas, for the 3 observations. You're of course right on the proliferation of handbooks. In my case, I always said I would do one in my life. I had several temptations, but when Jenny suggested, I said, yes, I'll do that with Jenny, because that's really the most interesting thing I could do. And I would not do another one. That's for sure. I think I take your point about the well-done book, edited books versus handbook, but I still think that because of the development of both urban research in a number of disciplines when it was not so important, and second, the development of different kind of research in different regions of the world, the handbook makes sense because it's just in the proliferations of journals. Handbooks make sense because it's very, when it is well done and when you have some effort to do more than just aggregation, as you both mentioned, it's still useful. So then we have a proliferation of handbook because it's the new thing making money for publishers, and then some of them will disappear and this thing will pass. But this is a time when, not just in urban studies, it's true for a number of domain, of course, all over the world, where a lot of discipline, subdomain, and regional traditions are revisiting, trying to locate themselves in different ways. So I think it also shows that the change of scale beyond the nation state and different method being used in all sorts of ways, and the multiplication of research being produced in different parts of the world, it could be useful to get this sort of books. Whether they're successful or not is a different story. But I think it's more than just the strategy of a handbook. I think there's a real need of think about just a discussion between the planning studies, the anthropologists, the historians, just all that. Having access to that is quite very precious, especially if you go beyond some regional tradition. So I take your point, but I think it's also connected to the evolution of disciplines and to the growing production of research in different parts of the world. That leads to a second point, and then I'll probably leave Jenny to answer and to keep going because I'll have to go in 5 minutes. Of course, you're absolutely right. In a way, it's even more unbalanced. If we look at the list of papers that were never delivered in our perfect wish list, actually some of them come from exactly because, of course, those authors are always solicited, they are always asked to deliver that sort of papers all the time. So they are even more overwhelmed by demands of this sort. So we failed also because there are not so many of them that could do this sort of things, and they didn't deliver as we wanted, but we understand very, very well. So I think your point is very well taken, and in further work on the global urban studies that you might be doing, thus I think developing this aspect and looking at the long-term consequence is clearly a very important part that could be done. And I like the idea of thinking about the historical sociology of some of these arguments and some of the production clusters of mode of production in a more systematic way. So you're opening there, starting from the critique of what we've done, I think a very, very suggesting a very, very interesting field of research. Maybe, Jenny, you want to finish on the second and third point? And then I will disappear at some point discreetly.
Okay, unless anyone wants to ask Patrick a direct question.
Before he leaves. So if
There you go.
anybody has a quick
got a
question,
burning desire. Okay, so I'll just proceed. So I guess, I mean, these are some of the areas perhaps where Patrick and I might head in slightly different directions as well, some of the questions you raised. So I think, John, thank you for your reminders about political science and local governments. I would say that in the areas where I'm doing research at the moment, in some African contexts, actually local government is irrelevant. It plays almost no role in shaping urban life. And we have a real problem to identify what is the nature of statehood in shaping the urban. So even though we have read about an urban turn in international development policy and trying to capacitate local governments, actually, this has the effect of concentrating power in relation to urban government in national states. So we certainly need a transscalar perspective, and we need something which looks at an emergent form of governance. And this, Baz, then to come to your third point about, is there a rapprochement between urban, regional, national, etc.? And I think actually, yes, and this is something where being open to learning from different contexts like Africa, as Laurent proposes, it suggests that we could start to think differently about the configuration of governance across different scales, I might say. I prefer to throw those all up in the air. And there's a great paper from Neil Brenner recently called Growth Machines, but at what scale? Fantastic. It really raises a lot of questions which resonate with those concerns which come out of an African context. So I think comparative urbanism for me is precisely about starting to learn to listen to those differences and to understand what can we explore with each other, across each other, and so on. So I'm not so sure that your work, John, is not so resonant in China. So, for example, you take Fulong Wu's paper in the handbook. He is thinking about what is urban development politics and the history of that across Chinese urbanization and urban development, and to think in a more global way about that. So there's a whole bunch of conversations to have there. So I'm very pleased you both opened that up. And then the second thing I would say is, well, the handbook, I agree with Patrick's response, which is to encourage us to think of handbooks as opening a certain possibility. So it's a certain formation, a certain form, certain media. What can we do with that? And I think it's particularly good for helping to consolidate and define a field. So I think in this case, it brought together authors who we wouldn't necessarily have put together. It put a range of things together. So it helps us to get a new grounding, another starting point. And the handbook's a great way to do that. But I think, Baz, your challenging points about where authors come from, I mean, I think I would have a slightly longer, more expansive list, especially if we look at the trajectories of people over time, where they are institutionally, where they're embedded, where they work, and so on. So we worked very hard to try and bring that range together. But you're quite right, we're very restricted still. So, but what do we do with that? So I think I would encourage, yes, we can critique and say we don't have a very global urban studies. That is a real problem. It's not something to feel proud to have identified. The point is to try and do something about it. And one of the main things that I propose we can do about it is to learn how to listen to each other and to build understandings across the diverse urban world that we have, to get good ways of working, so not to steal work from clever scholars in other parts of the world who never have time to write anything, but to build collaborative research and writing arrangements. So to really change our institutional formation, how can we allow those conversations to flourish so that in 10 years' time, somebody does a new handbook and it has a very different configuration? So Baz, I love your provocation, and I would turn it around into, well, what are you going to do about it? Let's get going. So, okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for your comments on the comments. Now the floor is open to everybody, so we can engage in a conversation with both the authors and the discussants. So don't be shy and start asking. I think that's an incredible opportunity to have here. Some of the authors
I'll try to be fair and channel my inner Patrick Le Galès.
Very good. So you can also raise your hand okay.
So just briefly, if let's say we had 1,000 urban scholars across the city regions of the globe. And we were going to be inspired by this book to try to work together systematically, not to some rigid framework where we all had the same methodology. Maybe we'd have a lot of arguments about which methodologies would be appropriate to which questions. But I would love to see responses to a series of questions. And I would begin with, what are the capacities and autonomies of city governments to promote economic development? It could be limited. There could be cases, as Jennifer says, where they have no capacity and no autonomy. But that would reflect some sort of state structure in that particular context. But to look at the variation across the places and try to say, well, what is it that accounts for this variation? And clearly, China is a very, very different context than Western market societies. And if we're to have a comparative global urban studies, it should be able to look at that difference. And another thing that I would look at is the impact of immigration on diversifying urban populations and the challenge of producing some degree of social cohesion out of very heterogeneous urban societies. And I'm sure there are a bunch of other questions that could be focal for very broad gauge research that would be very exciting to do. Anyway, those are my 2 cents about how to respond to Jennifer's last challenge, that we should say what we need to do and how we need to do it.
Maybe quickly, if time allows, to respond to what am I going to do about it, Jennifer? I would actually, during the presentation, you raised the comment about we need to learn how to build from specificity. So you theorize locally, basically, right? You build concepts from specificity. And I think we could actually do quite a lot of interesting work there, in the sense that if you would look at, let's say, cities or urban environments or whatever across the world, there is a huge range of, let's say, local vocabularies being used. Only some of these are captured, I think, in much of, let's say, codified as urban studies. But obviously, all these local vocabularies engage with cities and the urban in one way or another. So it's a very pragmatic, empirical, almost inductive starting point would be to actually start capturing this kind of diversity. And from there, we can start theorizing. From there, we can start generalizing. From there, we can start comparing. So that would be, I think, something there, because you will see that in countries that are now sort of, let's say, cities and countries that disappear from the map in a way, other types of vocabularies might be used that still are ultimately dealing with similar or comparable phenomena. That would be my gut feeling.
Can I respond quickly?
Of course, Jenny, go ahead.
So Baz, I think that's great. And I think there's such a diversity of ways of talking about urbanization and challenges that people face. So, in many contexts, the genre of informality is the form of urban development, in which case informality is a bit redundant. How do we start to think about the processes that are going on there? But then, even as I use the we, I think, well, who's this? Because many people around the world already have a strong theorization and understanding of those processes. So a lot of the challenges, I think, are about institutional formations. How do we structure our research grants so that we build collaborations of equivalence, so that the voices of senior scholars, very wise, very, very knowledgeable about different contexts, who already have those vocabularies and have articulated them, bring them into a wider conversation? And how do we structure incentives so that that's worthwhile? Because people in poor contexts are rushing around just trying to make a living, growing food, literally, even if you're an academic. So there's a lot for us to look at. How do we compose those conversations, and who gets to write about that? What does it mean to write about that? So that's the kind of institutional shove that I'm thinking we need to activate ourselves more to change the structure of what is international urban studies. And then, John, I think you're quite right. How do we open up that conversation? And one way is sometimes it's about just turning the conversation around. Sometimes we can't see that the way we frame the question might be because of where we are. So your question is, how do we account for the variation What are the capacities and autonomies of city governments in promoting urban economic development? Actually, I would say, well, let's look at who promotes urban development. Who are the key actors and how do we understand the relationships among them? And that's where I get, when I start in the context I'm working on at the moment, to a kind of transscalar perspective. But I guess I should roll back from making my own argument and suggest that the way in which questions are framed, which can be really productive, is very different for people in different traditions, different disciplines, different approaches. And the way you frame that question about how can you account for the variation of city government, as you point out, a few people in the handbook, they're born and Kubler and his colleague bring this forward and frame that question in a very interesting way. And all of these are productive. So I think that's what Patrick and I are eager to say, is that the urban world is so diverse and so complicated that we learn a lot from how these are framed. And the learning that we really hope is that we learn to value these different approaches and to use them generatively. Thanks.
So that's enriching rather than being a problem, indeed. We have a question. So Ali, the floor is yours.
Hi, sorry, I had to step out of class to ask this question. But I have a question from Bas and Jennifer. Continuing Bas's comment on the kind of geographic representation. I want to sort of comment on how I was introduced to urban studies as a field in Karachi in Pakistan. And I think what Bas was saying about a certain kind of centrality still overarching urban studies remains because of a certain genealogy that kind of follows from like discipline making, history making, from colonization, from the very early signs of the way disciplinary foundations were laid in, right? And I do think that like a lot of the stuff that we kind of read was also the Chicago school, very US centric, very Western European centric. And while I do agree that collaborations can kind of ease a kind of diversity into the field of urban studies, I also think that translation of writings that have already been written, a kind of effort into space making, where, like, I don't know, I would want to like ask you what you feel about this, like the stepping back of Europe and America and creating that kind of space for the rest of the world to fill in writing about urban issues and urban, just generally urban studies. And about what you feel, how you feel about moving beyond the post-colonial critique and into a decolonial practice, not just in thinking, but also in doing, when thinking about the making of a handbook or thinking about the making of an edited volume even. Yeah.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Ali. Those are super questions. And I really hope that you jump into that space, publish some great things. It would be lovely. And I think you're quite right in the sense that that's the institutional challenge that I was expressing, that somehow we have to reconfigure whose work gets presence, what is the form of the work that is read across different contexts, what announces itself, even if people may be modest about their work, what announces itself as international, as universalizing, as for everyone to read. So we have a lot to learn. Yes, you're right, to provincialize our practices, to make our reading much wider, to put ourselves in a more modest position. There's a lot of things we can do as individuals, as institutions, and in people who are involved in publishing and journals and books and so on. So I think I like the way you put that, to make space, not to drown out. And one of the problems with the international journal system is that it announces itself in the idiom of the well-resourced universities to define what is international. And I really think that the journals need to look at themselves much more closely. It's been a very difficult journey. I think some journals in urban studies have tried very hard, still struggle to shift the genre of what constitutes excellent knowledge. What is the point of rehearsing yet again the same theoretical perspective, rather perhaps bringing forward more empirical, innovative, really creative work that is announcing possibilities for new thinking? And there's a great paper by Sue Parnell and Edgar Peterson from the African Center for Cities, which pushes this idea that the methods, the data, the publishing criteria of urban studies need to change if African voices are going to be a part of it. And then the decolonial practice, yes, I think this is exactly where we need to go. So, you know, I'm surprised that you're still reading the same US-centric stuff, because there's been lots of other urban studies work published over the years, and we should be composing in our context, Karachi, Cape Town, wherever, composing different kinds of reading, learning from different authors. So one of the most fundamental comparative methods is to simply read stuff from other places and other writers. You can do it in your chair at your desk. And I think a decolonial practice for me, you know, this is why I turn to comparative methods. I don't know, for Patrick, I think this is much more long-standing, but he's certainly done very wide-ranging comparative work across Mexico, India, Brazil, across different parts of Europe. So how is it possible to take forward the practice of doing urban studies differently? And for me, that was the hunch of comparison. So in my own book, Comparative Urbanism, this was to try and really open up the possibilities for constructing new kinds of knowledge. But at base, you're quite right, this needs an institutional transformation. And for that, we're all responsible. So I'm hoping I can look to you for innovations, practices, writing. Great to hear your thoughts on that, Ali. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any other question? Go ahead. Also comments, not necessarily questions.
Yeah, it's a bit boring to hear from me all the time. So you could just take a round of anyone can, you know, say some things and then we can wrap up.
No, it's definitely not boring, but maybe someone is feeling uncomfortable, ask a question. You can also write the question in the chat box. So, Tatiana,
if I may, maybe that's a naive question. So the way you presented this just now, and I'm very intrigued by this, and it always gets me going. How do we do this? So if we want to be truly global and talk about urban studies in this globalized and not just from the European or the American perspective and the history, and use these diverse epistemologies and methodologies. How do we do that? I mean, one person cannot do that. And with you touched upon that the journals have their own logics and the universities have their own logics. So how do we do that? So how do we put out more of our colleagues from the parts of the world that have not been heard so far? And it's not just about what they write right now, but also their history, their own sciences and their own urban studies. So how do we go about this? Because this now is one handbook, and I know that many others and other journals try to do this, and they struggle with that a lot. How do we go about it? Do we just retreat? Do we try to compare more? Is that enough? Where do we start? And but the second part of this question is, so if the handbook you presented today is a starting point or the first step, what's the next step? Because I feel like maybe this is the naive question now. Just talking about it over and over again helps us to see the problem, but we haven't found a way forward just yet. And I feel like only writing about it is not enough to be a bit more provocative. Yeah.
Thank you, Tatiana. Jenny, you want to react immediately?
Well, I think I sympathize with the sentiment. I would say, though, that what also we need to keep in mind is urban is huge. diverse, complex, so many different things, so many different voices. It's not possible to hold it all together and think I'm the one who's going to define what the field is going to be. So I think modesty in the midst of all this complexity, learning alongside one another, learning from places we wouldn't have perhaps thought of, is important. And I think there's also a sense to respect the agendas that other people bring forward. So I think things like extended urbanization or planetary urbanization so profound in places like Brazil, Southeast Asia. These were leading places for thinking these long before we had Brenner Schmidt come up with stories about that. These are very profound configurations of the urban going forward. Urbanization emerging in very far-flung places and remote places, urbanization in areas that people think of as rural or wilderness. This is a very important phenomenon. And the places where this can be learned from and where theorization is happening about that are places that are often ignored in so-called international urban studies. So I think in Africa, for example, some of these configurations, the urbanization of formerly traditional areas, there's sprawling urbanization of major cities because of very different kinds of urbanization processes, or urban territories emerging around ports or things like that. These are very big agendas. So before we dismiss certain theoretical directions, we really need to think about whose agendas are these and how are they going to be important in shaping the future of urban studies. But as we do that, then I really have to stress the need for respectful collaborations. So I saw advertised just recently a talk which has taken the title from a very creative South African book by Graham Gotson, Nyaka Mosiana from the Gauteng City Region Observatory. I'm sitting here in Joburg at the moment, which is pushing this into the world in the name of somebody else. How is that right? You know, how is it right also that perhaps somebody shares all their ideas with you, but you write up the paper and then it's your paper? No, we have to, these are very basic things that need to change. But, you know, this is my kind of thing. But I think the handbook as such proposes that we can't corral everything into a right way. We can't be policing ourselves as to what is the proper methodology or where stories will come from or what kind of methods we'll use, that the proliferation of the urban takes so many different forms. It is complex, it is nuanced, it is experienced, but it's also something we can only apprehend if we build up some data at a wider level. How do we know about urbanization and the rate of urbanization in poor countries? We need to find some data to understand that. So there's a range of ways in which we build pictures of the urban, and I think opening up a respectful and inclusive approach to that. This is our the handbook can achieve that. We'll be very happy, I think.
Absolutely. We have one question in the chat by Alisa Key. I'm going to read it loud, so it's also recorded. Adding on to Ali's question on making spaces for less prominent perspectives, in what ways do you think learning by doing or embodied practice-based methods can contribute to urban studies research, particularly given the strong emphasis on knowledge circulation via written, spoken modes within academic research? So what is this relationship and what's the contribution of learning by doing or embodied practice-based methods?
Well, I think this is really important, especially in contexts where there's, you know, a lot of emergent formation of urban environments. And the important paper here for me is from Gautam Baan in Environment and Urbanization 2019, which was first presented at the African Central Cities Conference in Cape Town then. And he adopts what feels to me like an interestingly Lefebvrean approach, which is to define three moments, three concepts that are in configuration within the practices of planners: squat, repair, consolidate. And in a way, the Lefebvrean connection is not an innocent one that I make here, because in fact, Lefebvre's approach was to be very much focused on an embodied and practice-based production of the urban. In the handbook, we have a few great examples of that, especially the paper from Julien Boudreau that I mentioned to you. So I think this is a direction crucial, but the difficulty is then how do you start to talk about that? And as soon as you start to share that idea with people in a particular context, in a wider context, then you're starting to use vocabularies and concepts. And I think we need to be ready to be accountable for those concepts. That is, being embodied or practice-based doesn't operate as an alibi for a wider conversation or conceptualization, I would say. I'm not sure what Patrick would say about this, but I think people across the urban world are doing all kinds of practice. So perhaps if you're Gartenbahn or Sophie Oldfield, you're really building close collaborations with people in very poor communities, trying to find a foothold, or Solly Benjamin's idea of occupancy urbanism in India. But many people are also trying to influence practice and investment and ideas of policy. So urban studies has a very privileged relationship with practice, and what exactly that involves for people in different parts of the world, we really need to think about. So my African colleagues that I work with at the moment are much more likely to be providing embodied support to World Bank, as much as embodied support to communities. This is a diverse practice to try and realize something in different contexts. And I would also say that Gartenbahn's piece, which has that hope to be embodied and practice-based, articulates itself as an India-wide and Global South-wide conceptualization of how we should do urban studies. So that's to create quite a big conceptual arena. So I think, this sort of materiality, embodied practice, and conceptualization have a complex configuration in different ways, from Weber to Deleuze. There are different ways to think about that. But I have no doubt that whatever the kind of, motivations of urban scholars who are often very embedded in particular contexts these are often, for sure, very practice-based. And how we define that and think about that in different ways is another interesting conversation. So thank you for that. I look forward to your reflections on that somewhere or other.
Exactly. So thanks a lot. Are there any further questions or comments? I don't know if John or Bas would like to add something, or
maybe very brief to the last point, because I'm always a bit struck how for some reason we think of urban practice, and then apparently all the stuff that we do is not considered practice, whereas I consider myself a very practical person. I do a lot of practical stuff. Even much of the writing that I do is very practical, in the sense it's a practice. So for me, there's also we've seen over the last decades, I think, a kind of prioritization of writing as a privileged type of output at the expense of other types of engagement, let's put it like that, which I think is part of the problem that we're trying to solve, in a sense. And it's I have a feeling sometimes that let's say, a stronger openness to different kinds of outputs, using that word that I don't like, also allows for other types of engagement where it's sometimes easier to engage with, let's say, others outside of the very, let's say, the bubble of urban studies. And it has to do with language capacities, etc., that kind of story. But there's a story to be told, I think, about the kind of work we do, and let's say the multiple dimensions of the practices, and to recognize them as equally valuable. And some translate better than others. So yeah.
I mean, I would just nuance that a little bit by thinking the practice of defining the urban as existing or working out what it is. This is quite an intellectual practice and very important and transformative. So to go back to Elena Trubina's paper, the Soviet system defined government at a regional scale, and the urban is quite lost in all that planning. So defining through comparative thinking about the urban, placing the urban in a globalizing context. This has been quite important to identify that. And if we're facing a future where we don't really know where urban territories are or what they look like, and we can't say so clearly, this is a city, this is an urban administration. It's also an intellectual practice to take forward some of that. Yeah, I would agree with you, Bas.
Yes, John?
I'd just like to conclude by saying I'm very sympathetic to and open to Jennifer's charge to all of us that we need to listen to new voices and to maybe radically different conceptualizations arising out of settings that are maybe on the margins of the world or different from what's come out of the advanced world. And I would just say, Jennifer, I know you encourage a lot of people to do this. So I'm looking to you for guidance as to what are the most important and interesting things to read. And I hope you'll let us and me know what you do think is important to read. I appreciate it.
Jenny, you want to give immediate suggestions? Or
Well, read the handbook. So I would say
I already did that.
I know. So I mean, the great thing about the handbook, for all that's it's constrained global presence thing of scholars, as Baz pointed out, I think is it opens into quite a wide range of possibilities for reading. So what I'm currently really inspired by is this African studies work on negotiated statehood. Not to assume where or what the state is and at what scale or what territory or what space it occupies or what it does, but to see these emergent formations, what Christian Lund calls twilight institutions. For me, this is really, it goes to the core of how we understand the nature of the state, the nature of government. I think it speaks more widely than the African studies context. So I would say start in places where people generally are not reading and learning much theoretically, but treat places as theory, because I think a number of post-colonial critics have responded very vigorously to attempts to place their contributions as simply descriptive, specific analyses, rather than we are theorizing. And I think Patrick pointed that out in his overview. So that it's also about how you treat things, that you treat them as not just an example of somewhere else, but something that's speaking profoundly to your own most fundamental theorization. That would be, so it's more like a way of reading. But I think Patrick is perhaps more pragmatic, and of course he reads widely about these things, and he writes about objects that have a relevance and a presence and an institutional dynamics in many different places. So papers about huge metropolises, for example, and governing large metropolises, which Phil Harrison from here in Johannesburg talks about. How do different kind of governmental configurations emerge to manage these vast urban regions, whether it's in Brazil, South Africa, India, China, or Russia, which were the cases he looks at, the BRICS. So yeah, I think we can't be heroes. we can take steps and we can be ethical, hopefully, in things. And I think make a space. So if people are running institutional settings, setting courses, setting reading lists, running journals, deciding on what's published, convening a handbook, we have a grave responsibility, and we did our best. So I look forward to the next iteration. Ali, perhaps you will bring forward a nice collection with a different configuration. Be super. So I think that's good. Thanks, Yuri.
No, thanks to you. Actually, we're trying to put forward this agenda of making the narration and the debate about these issues more complex in that direction by debating last year your book on comparative urbanism and today the handbook. I think it's an important, very important contribution, and we should not, of course, forget other places. So I don't want to give up studying European cities, but maybe we are looking at European cities through different eyes now. So we can look also into Vienna, where I'm living now, with a completely different understanding of how space is constructed and what role does space and the different actors and the state play here, and then comparing that to other places. So cities are not just independent units, as it has been said, and they are embedded in complex multiscalar relations. So probably the issue of jurisdictions should be considered as a relevant aspect in the construction of space and the governance of that space. But that will be the topic for another discussion, I would say.
Well, and we should add your wonderful paper with Claire Coulomb to the reading list, because this is to bring a post-colonial perspective to writings about European cities, it's a very lovely paper. So thank you for that.
Actually, we are preparing now an intervention section for IJUR based on that, including more post-colonial perspectives into the analysis of the European city. So that's exactly going in this direction, making it a more complex understanding of what went on and the colonial heritage and how it shaped the current European city landscape. So I would like to thank everybody, in particular Jenny and Patrick, but also Bas and John for very wonderful discussion and presentations, and also you for attending this event. We will go on until the end of this academic year, so with 2 more presentations in May and June on completely different topics. One will be on nature-based solutions in May, and the other one will be on Instagram and the city, so using other types of data and understanding urban development in Europe, but beyond Europe. We will inform, of course, everybody who registered for today's presentation, but so keep tuned, and thanks a lot to everybody. And I stop now the registration and wish you a wonderful evening. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And
Bye-bye.
thanks so much to John and Baz. It was really great comment.
Thanks, Jenny.
Enjoy the rest of the evening. Bye, everybody.